Before going home, we also went to visit the Toolan cottage at Chasefield. Only Teresa still lives close by. As such, it has been Teresa, over these many years, who greeted those from across the Atlantic, whose roots, like her own, were on this same tree-covered hill. For there, among the trees, is the epicenter of our shared past, a genetic marker of a different sort. Driving to the cottage, I recalled my visit from 20 years earlier. That summer's vegetation and nettles made it difficult to reach, but once through, I stood in an open field. The doorframe was low but welcoming. The front of the cottage was finished with stucco, but its sides still reflected that this was a stone cottage. The thatched roof was letting go, and although the windows no longer looked out on an early 20th century landscape, from inside it was as if they did. The place had a familiar, welcoming feel, in the way that my grandfather's home in Rathkeel had not. Pulling up, it was apparent that the cottage was still vacant. But that November, with the summer's growth gone, the area leading up to it was far more open. On the ground were fallen leaves, and it reminded me a bit of New England. October gave a party. The leaves by hundreds came. It was a line from a poem my grandmother would often recite. On the side of the cottage, shadows of the surrounding trees were cast on its stone wall. The interior appeared unaffected by the weather and years. The stone hearth, although unused, still looked as if it had plenty of warmth to give. Despite its condition, it was easy to imagine turf fire slowly burning, a dog napping at the foot of a bed, and the life once held within its walls. Standing inside, I was reminded of a day when my grandmother, lost in the movement of time and place, asked my father, "Hugh, have you brought the cows in?" He nodded assuringly. "Ah, good," she replied. "They say we're to get rain." The morning after I returned home from my trip, I noticed an open box in my parents' garage. Turns out, in it were some of Delia's belongings, suddenly unearthed because of electrical work. It contained a number of photographs. There was my cousin Bernadette, seated in between my grandparents, photos of my Aunt Mary's beach house at Seabrook. There was one of Pa holding the hand of his granddaughter as they turned their backs to the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Also in the group was one of my grandparents disembarking in New York on a return trip from Ireland. But it was the photo resting on the top of all others that first caught my attention. It was of an old man with white hair smiling. Behind him was a window painted with red trim. Before I turned the photo over, I had already guessed its inscription. The photo was of my grandmother's brother Hugh, smiling in front of the very cottage I had just visited. In the days following the holidays, along the long road to spring, I found myself increasingly absorbed in my research. Based on Teresa's advice, I started with the 1901 and 1911 census. In 1901, the Chasefield cottage was listed as 2 rooms constructed of a stone and concrete walls and a thatched roof. Mary was listed as the head of the family. Delia's father, Patrick, appeared in the English census the same year, where he labored as a farmer in Yorkshire. By 1911, Delia was no longer at Chasefield. She also left to work in England. There she lived at Tulse Hill Park in London and serviced a family of 5 as a general domestic servant. By 1912, Delia was back in Ireland, getting ready to leave for America. Just prior to her departure, Delia's family would have likely held an American wake. I imagined that night a warm turf fire burned beneath the arched hearth of Chasefield Cottage, and the smallness of its borders would have been filled with people. Sweaters and woolen coats would have hung on its walls, and with the Dutch door half opened, the sound of her brother Hugh's voice would have risen softly towards the stars. Fiddles and flutes would have rejoiced in songs like "The Lakes of Sligo," "The Hills of Knocknarea," or Hugh's favorite, "The Golden Jubilee." In addition to the census, I also used the online passenger records and found Delia on the SS Cumric, another White Star ship. She was 19, and according to the ship's records, listed herself as a cook. It set sail on May 10th, 1912, less than a month from the Titanic's departure from Queenstown. I never heard Delia or really anyone in our family reference the Cumric. I ordered a couple of black and white photographs of the ship. It was also built by Harlan and Wolff, and if she was related to the Titanic, it was as the ugly stepsister. She was over 200 feet shorter, slower by 10 knots, and could accommodate only 20% of first-class passengers. She was used at times as a military ship, and was even torpedoed by the same German sub that sunk the Lusitania. But on May 5th, 1912, she served as a passenger ship and brought my grandmother and many others to America.